think we've all just been reminded of the power of words. I want to introduce another very eloquent man, author, Professor Noam Chomsky.
Well, I've been given the privilege of closing this really significant event, and I'm not going to abuse the privilege by dragging it out. Even if in a few words, or for that matter, even in a lot of words, I wouldn't really dare to add anything, to try to add anything to the powerful statements and eloquent calls to action that you've heard and participated in for the last several hours. I'll just say a couple of, actually it's much more appropriate, I think, for me simply to join in silent commemoration of the victims of Kent State and Jackson State and many other martyrs, some of whom have been mentioned, others not, for lack of time. But also to suggest that we remind ourselves that of something we all know, that their sacrifices and their struggle have made an enormous difference. When we look around and we see the problems and horrors and atrocities and injustice in this country and those much worse ones elsewhere that privileged people here have a great deal of responsibility for, it's easy to forget something which is true and important, namely that it's a much more civilized country than it was 40 years ago. And the reason it's a much more civilized country is not because of magic or taking pills. It's because of constant, dedicated struggle and commitment on the part, most dramatically, of young people, some of whom have lost their lives tragically in the course of that struggle, but in doing so have also inspired others to go on, work harder, do more, and achieve quite a lot. If you look at policies and attitudes and understanding among sectors of power and privilege, it's true that they haven't changed because the institutions haven't changed. But the circumstances have changed, and that means that policies are executed differently and with different constraints. And one of the most important constraints is that the population is no longer passive, apathetic, and supportive, as it was 40 years ago. We have to remember that when John F. Kennedy launched the attack against South Vietnam, sent the U.S. Air Force to bomb South Vietnam, authorized crop destruction, chemical warfare, massive, what we now call ethnic cleansing, driving millions of people into concentration camps, there was no protest. In fact, there were years before there was any protest. People didn't particularly like it, but nothing happened. 20 years later, the Ronald Reagan administration faced a rather similar situation in Central America. In Central America, the U.S. had been running vicious terror states which had been carrying out large-scale atrocities against their own populations, but they were losing control. That's what happened in South Vietnam in 1960 when John F. Kennedy came in. There was a Latin American-style terror state that the U.S. had established in violation of the international agreements on Vietnam. By the time Kennedy came in, it had killed maybe 60 or 70,000 people, aroused resistance, couldn't control that resistance, and the U.S. simply moved in force with consequences we don't have to discuss. Remember that South Vietnam was always the main target of the U.S. attack, always, right through to the end. Reagan tried to do the same thing in Central America. They made the same initial moves that Kennedy did. They were following the script, in fact, but they had to back off. And they had to back off because of a completely unanticipated popular reaction all over the country, in the Midwest, in churches, and all kinds of places where they never expected to see any reaction at all. The protest was sufficient, so they backed off. What happened in Central America was bad enough, but B-52s and large-scale chemical warfare and saturation bombing would have been a lot worse. Well, you know, that may not be something to be very proud about. We made it less awful than it, in fact, was. But that means for the people who suffered under it, it's a difference. And they know it. And here lies some of the background. In fact, just take attitudes toward the Vietnam War. They're very striking. Among elite sectors, sectors of power and privilege, we know what they are. Read the newspapers. So there's been a huge amount of commentary in the last couple of weeks on, you know, the 25th anniversary, and it's kind of striking. There's a spectrum of opinion. The spectrum is between what are called doves and hawks. Hawks are the ones who say it was a noble cause and we should have won, and if we hadn't been stabbed in the back and so on, we would have won. Doves are the ones who say it was a noble cause and we should have won, but it was was costing us too much and it probably wasn't worth it, so let's do better next time. That's the doves, and that's not an exaggeration. I'll spare you quotes. It was the same in the late 60s and the early 60s. The doves and the hawks were the same. Well, the doves and the hawks don't include everyone. For example, they don't include about 70% of the population, and haven't for the last 30 years. One thing that, one of the real achievements, one of the civilizing effects of the activism of the 60s was it created massive changes in attitudes. So for 30 years now, there are regular public opinion studies on international affairs where people are asked, what do you think about the war in Vietnam? And given a lot of choices. And a steady 70%, right up to the last one last year, roughly 70% says the war was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Now, these are striking numbers. Everyone who says that is making it up for themselves. They didn't read it in the newspapers. They didn't hear it on television. They went to college. They didn't read it in their textbook, because that's not what elites say. They say it was a mistake, or it was a misunderstanding, or it was benign intentions that went wrong, and so on. But the population says something else. They say, no, it was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. And that attitude stays resilient over a huge effort in the last 30 years to drive the memories out of people's heads, to reshape the history, to recast it, you know, to put it a different way, and so on. That's a striking and important fact. And elite elements know it. We can go back to the background of what is probably the background of the Kent State killings. Right after the Tet Offensive in January 1968, when it became clear that this war was going to go on for a long time and would be costly to the United States, Lyndon Johnson called on the Pentagon to send 200,000 more troops to Vietnam. They didn't want to do it. They refused. And their reasons were interesting and important. Their reasons were they said they would need the troops for civil disorder control in the United States because the population was out of control. And they said who? Parts of the population that are expected to be apathetic and passive, women, young people, you know, terrified minorities and so on. They said they're just out of control. If we send more troops and keep the war going, we'll have a civil war on our hands, so we'll need them here. Well, you know, it doesn't take much to translate that into the mentality that led to Jackson State and Kent State and plenty of other things like them. Through the 1970s, activist movements expanded significantly. I mean, the major popular movements that have really had have had a lasting effect on American society and, in fact, on the world, they're sort of children of the 70s. The human rights movements, the feminist movement, the environmental movements, later the anti-apartheid movements, the Central America solidarity movements, right now the anti-sweatshop movements, often young people at the head, and in fact the very dramatic and large-scale opposition to the international economic arrangements, the corporate-run globalization. That's, as was said before, that's extremely significant. These are movements that have won real victories. They blocked the multilateral agreement on investments. They put the fear of God into the international financial institutions and the World Trade Organization. They've actually changed their policies. And they draw from very varied constituencies which have had nothing much to do with each other in the past. They're international, global in scale, and very promising in their effects. And people in power know it. One of these victories was the defeat of the fast-track legislation a couple of years ago. When that happened, the Wall Street Journal had a report tearing its hair out over this tragedy. And it said that obviously this thing is great and it's a shame we can't get it through. But they said opponents of the legislation have what they called an ultimate weapon. The ultimate weapon is the population's against it. And no matter how we try to brainwash them and coerce them and whatever deceit we use and so on, they remain against it. The Reagan administration understood exactly the same thing in the 80s. When they couldn't get the population to back their intended war in Central America, they established a thing called the Office of Public Diplomacy, state propaganda agency. It's illegal, of course, and it was finally exposed in the course of the Iran-Contra hearings. After it was exposed, high officials of the administration explained what they were doing. They said, we're carrying out the kind of campaign that you would carry out in enemy territory. And that's correct. They regard the population as enemy territory. The population is an ultimate weapon that we can't seem to put back in its holster or wherever you put a weapon. These things are really significant. They make a change in the United States, and given the power of the United States, they make a change in the world. So yes, policies don't change, interests don't change, institutional sources of them don't change, but conditions do. And the most important condition is the domestic population. And that changes. It changes because of dedicated activism, sometimes inspired by terrible tragedies. And I think that's the message that we ought to be taking away with us from commemoration of these atrocities and many others like them.